Today, I was on a commuter train, heading to my divorce hearing after 30 years of marriage. While helping an elderly man pick up his spilled luggage, we started talking. After hearing how my wife and son were about to steal the logistics company I built from scratch, he quietly asked to come with me. When we walked into the mediation room, my wife's face went completely pale the second she saw him. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against the people you trusted most. I am John Fletcher. I am 65 years old, and my life was about to be legally dismantled on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise. I sat by the window of the morning commuter train, watching the gray blur of the city outskirts pass by. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. The man staring back was exhausted, his shoulders slumped, under a cheap gray suit I had bought a decade ago. I looked down at my hands resting on my scuffed imitation leather briefcase. They were weathered, scarred, and heavily calloused. They were the hands of a man who had spent 4 decades working the loading docks, driving the delivery trucks, and eventually building a regional logistics company from a single rusted van into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Those calluses were the foundation of my family's comfortable life. They paid for the sprawling house in the suburbs. They paid for my son Tyler's college tuition. They paid for the luxury vacations and the designer clothes my wife Barbara demanded year after year. But those calloused hands were no match for the aggressive corporate asset stripping Barbara had planned for me today. After 30 years of marriage, Barbara had completely blindsided me with divorce papers. There was no warning, no attempt at counseling, just a sudden violent freezing of my access to the company accounts and a restraining order that locked me out of the main office. I opened my cheap briefcase and pulled out my meager defense notes. I did not have an expensive legal team. Barbara had drained our joint accounts to hire a notoriously ruthless lawyer, Gavin Pierce. All I had were a few printed spreadsheets and a desperate hope that I could convince the mediator to let me keep my modest pension. I did not even care about the house anymore. I just wanted enough to survive the rest of my days in a small apartment without having to go back to driving trucks on the night shift. I squinted at the numbers on the paper, trying to memorize the figures, trying to build a fortress out of fragile logic. I needed to hold on to something. But the train violently lurched forward, throwing me off balance. The brakes screeched loudly, and the sudden jolt completely interrupted my train of thought. Across the aisle, an elderly man who had been sitting quietly lost his grip on his luggage. He looked to be in his late 80s, dressed in a sharply tailored, albeit old-fashioned, navy blue overcoat. A heavy, genuine leather briefcase tumbled from his lap and hit the metal floor of the train car. The clasp snapped open, and thick stacks of paper manila folders and blueprints scattered everywhere across the dirty aisle. Without hesitating, I dropped my own meaningless notes and immediately slid out of my seat. It is just my nature. When you spend your life managing logistics and fixing broken supply chains, you automatically step in when things fall apart. I knelt on the floor and began gathering the documents. The elderly man thanked me, his voice gravelly but steady. I picked up a thick, glossy folder that had slid under my shoe. As I tapped the edges of the papers against the floor to straighten them, my eyes caught the bold headings on the documents. They were corporate acquisition blueprints. I saw charts detailing leveraged buyouts, asset liquidation strategies, and multi-million-dollar transfer clauses. I am a logistics man, not a Wall Street banker, but I recognized the language of corporate takeover when I saw it. I did not pry further. I respectfully closed the folder and handed the stack back to him. He placed the documents safely back into his briefcase and clicked the heavy brass locks shut. He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were pale blue, incredibly sharp and calculating. They did not match the frailty of his hands. He took in my cheap suit, my worn-out briefcase on the seat, and the defeated slump of my posture. "You look like a man heading to his own funeral," he said bluntly. I let out a bitter, exhausted laugh as I sat back down across from him. I wiped a smudge of dust from my knee. "Worse," I replied, my voice hoarse. I am heading to an execution by mediation. I attempted to turn my attention back to my own scattered notes, wanting to retreat into the safety of my silence. I just wanted to survive the next few hours. But the elderly man did not look away. That sharp, calculating gaze pinned me down to my seat. An execution usually implies a crime was committed, he said smoothly, leaning slightly forward. What exactly are they executing you for? Normally I am a private man. I do not air my dirty laundry to strangers on public transit. But sitting there listening to the rhythmic clatter of the train tracks, a strange sense of surrender washed over me. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. My reputation had been smeared, my life's work stolen, and my future erased. So I opened my mouth and let the truth spill out. I am being executed for trusting the wrong people, I told him. My wife Barbara and her lawyer, a shark named Gavin Pierce, found a loophole in my business trust. They locked me out of the logistics company I spent my entire life building. The old man simply nodded, encouraging me to continue. I told him about the sleepless nights, the early years when Barbara supported me, and how the money eventually changed her. But the theft of the business was not what was breaking my heart. The real execution was what she had done to my son. I looked down at my calloused hands, feeling a deep, suffocating ache in my chest. Tyler, I said, my voice cracking slightly. My boy. He is 30 years old now, works as a manager in my company. I built it all for him. It was always meant to be his inheritance. But Barbara and Gavin got into his head. They convinced Tyler that I was secretly planning to sell the family business to a massive conglomerate and leave him and his wife Natalie with absolutely nothing. They manufactured fake emails. They twisted my words. They turned my own son against me so completely that he refuses to even answer my phone calls. He believes I am a monster who is going to sell his future out from under him. Now he is testifying against me today. I expected the old man to offer some polite words of pity. I expected him to shake his head and offer empty condolences about how cruel the world could be. Instead, his posture shifted. The grandfatherly demeanor vanished, replaced by an intense, laser-focused business acumen. He did not offer pity. He offered an interrogation. What is your annual EBITDA? He asked sharply. What is your fleet size? How many regional distribution hubs do you own outright versus lease? I blinked, taken aback by the highly specific insider questions. But my business was my life, and the numbers were etched into my brain. I rattled them off automatically. 3.2 million in earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. A fleet of 42 commercial freight trucks. 3 regional hubs owned, 2 leased. The old man absorbed the data in an instant. And this lawyer, Gavin Pierce, you are certain he is the one orchestrating the asset transfer? I nodded. He is the one driving the knife in. Barbara is just holding the handle. The train began to slow down, the brakes screeching, as we entered the downtown metropolitan station. The automated voice announced our arrival. The old man reached down and picked up his heavy leather briefcase. He stood up slowly, smoothing the lapels of his tailored navy overcoat with deliberate precision. Where is this mediation taking place? He asked. I sighed, packing away my useless notes into my scuffed bag. The Sterling Building, I told him, Suite 4000. It is a few blocks from here. I stood up, preparing to nod goodbye and walk off to face my demise alone. But the old man did not move toward the exit doors. He looked at me, a faint, almost dangerous smile playing on his thin lips. Well, John, he said, adjusting his grip on his briefcase. It seems we share the same destination. I have a meeting in the exact same building today. In fact, I insist we walk in together. I looked at him, completely confused by his sudden insistence, but I was too tired to argue. I simply nodded, unaware that the frail stranger I had just helped was about to turn my execution into a battlefield. The ride up the elevator felt like a slow ascent to the gallows. The metal box hummed with a low, steady vibration that settled deep in my bones. I stood rigidly, holding the handle of my battered briefcase so tightly my knuckles turned white. Next to me, Winston stood perfectly still. He was a silent presence, but a grounding one. He did not ask questions, and he did not offer empty platitudes. He just watched the digital numbers above the door climb higher and higher. The air in the elevator grew colder the further up we went, as if the building itself was draining the warmth from my body. I was suffocating under the weight of 30 years of memories that were about to be erased with the stroke of a pen. The elevator chimed softly. The steel doors slid open silently to reveal the 40th floor. The reception area was a vast expanse of white marble and frosted glass, designed specifically to make a person feel small. It was a place constructed to intimidate. We walked past the receptionist, who did not even bother to look up from her sleek computer monitor. Winston walked a few paces behind me as a quiet shadow trailing my steps. I approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the main conference room. My heart hammered against my ribs. I took a deep breath, pushing the heavy door open and stepping right into the lion's den. The mediation room was massive and intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the city I had spent my entire life navigating from the ground up. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, reflecting the cold, fluorescent lights above. Sitting at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her conquered territory was Barbara. She looked absolutely immaculate. She was wearing a tailored navy dress that probably cost more than my first delivery truck. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a string of pearls resting against her collarbone. But it was her face that truly stopped me in my tracks. There was no sadness there. There was no regret for the 30 years we had shared together. There was only a smug, radiant confidence. She was looking at me the way a predator looks at a trapped animal. Seated right beside her was Gavin Pierce. He was exactly the kind of lawyer you hire when you do not want justice but total annihilation. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit him with predatory perfection. His gold cufflinks caught the light as he steepled his fingers together, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He offered me a slow, measured smile that did not reach his cold, dark eyes. He looked entirely comfortable in this room. He looked like a man who deeply enjoyed watching people lose everything they loved. My eyes did not linger on Barbara or her hired shark. My gaze was immediately drawn to the far end of the long table. Tyler was there. My son. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The young man I had trained to understand supply chains and warehouse management. He was wearing the dark blue suit I had bought for him 2 years ago to celebrate his promotion to regional manager. My chest tightened so painfully I could barely draw a breath. I wanted to run to him and ask him why he was doing this. But Tyler would not even look at me. He sat rigidly in his expensive leather chair, staring intently at his own hands resting on his lap. His jaw was clenched tight, and his shoulders were hunched defensively. The physical imbalance of power in the room was overwhelming. They were a united front of wealth and calculated betrayal. I was just a tired old man in a cheap suit standing alone by the door with a stranger. I took a step forward, entirely ignoring Gavin, who had opened his mouth to speak. I walked toward the table, keeping my eyes fixed solely on my son. I called out his name, letting my voice crack slightly in the heavy silence of the room. I begged Tyler to just look at me. Tyler flinched visibly at the sound of my voice. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he kept his gaze firmly fixed on the mahogany table. Barbara let out a sharp, condescending sigh. She leaned forward, crossing her arms over the polished wood. She told me to leave him alone and commanded me with a voice dripping with artificial sympathy to stop talking. She claimed I had done enough damage to him and stated they were not there to listen to my emotional manipulation. I ignored her completely. My heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces, but I needed my son to look me in the eye. I pleaded with Tyler, taking another step closer to the heavy table. I asked him if he remembered the summer he turned 15. I reminded him of how we spent every single weekend in the sweltering heat painting that second-hand delivery van. I told him I let him pick the colors and even put his initials in the company logo. I explained that I built every single piece of this business for him so he would never have to struggle the way I did. I asked him how he could sit there and let them tear it all away from us. The silence stretched out agonizingly. Finally, Tyler slowly raised his head. When his eyes met mine, I felt the breath leave my lungs entirely. There was no love in his gaze. There was no memory of those hot summer days working side by side in the garage. There was only a deep, misplaced anger. He asked me why he should look at me after what I had planned to do. His voice trembled with a rage I simply did not understand. He demanded to know why he should care about painting some old van when I was secretly planning to sell them all out. I froze in place. I stared at him completely bewildered and asked him what he was talking about, shaking my head in disbelief. I told him I never planned to sell anything. Tyler let out a bitter, humorless laugh that sounded exactly like his mother. He told me to stop lying and snapped at me while leaning forward and gripping the edge of the table. He said his mother had found the emails and that Gavin had showed him the hidden financial projections I supposedly commissioned. He accused me of planning to liquidate the entire company. He claimed I was going to sell it to some massive corporate conglomerate to take the money and disappear. He said I was going to leave his wife Natalie and the kids with absolutely nothing. He accused me of selling his future to the highest bidder just to fund my own retirement. The lie was so monstrous and so meticulously crafted that I felt physically ill. I looked at Barbara, who was observing the destruction of my relationship with our son with a calm, satisfied expression. She had poisoned him. She had fed him fabricated documents and twisted my life's work into a weapon against me. I felt a desperate, frantic need to make him understand the truth. I reached my hands out toward him across the table. I begged Tyler to listen to me while my voice rose with desperate urgency. I told him I never commissioned any financial projections and that I would never sell his future. I explained that everything I had done, from every long night on the road to every missed holiday, was to build an empire for him to inherit. I insisted I was protecting the company for him and his children. I told him they were lying to him and using him. I took a deep breath, ready to dismantle the lies they had fed him and ready to fight for my son's trust. But before another word could leave my mouth, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the massive room. Gavin Pierce had forcefully slammed a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents onto the polished mahogany table. The sound was like a gunshot, severing the emotional connection I was desperately trying to build with my son. Gavin stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a gesture of absolute control. He announced that he had heard enough of the theatrics, and his voice was smooth-cold and entirely devoid of empathy. He stated they were not there to reminisce about the past or listen to my desperate fabrications. He told me I was completely out of options and that we were there to discuss my unconditional surrender. He pushed the massive predatory settlement document across the smooth wood until it stopped right in front of my hands. Gavin let his hand linger on the thick stack of paper before slowly withdrawing it. The document sat there, demanding my attention. I looked down at the crisp white pages. The title page bore the name of my life's work, reduced to a cold, sterile case number. I did not want to touch it. I felt that if I laid my hands on that paper, I would be accepting the reality of this nightmare. Gavin leaned back in his leather chair, crossing one leg over the other. He adjusted his silk tie and began to speak with a terrifying calmness. He told me to read the terms. He said they were being incredibly generous, considering the circumstances of our separation. He claimed Barbara wanted to ensure I was not left destitute on the street, out of respect for the time we shared. I reached out and opened the heavy cover. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon until I found the financial breakdown. I stopped breathing entirely. The numbers printed on the page were an absolute insult to my entire existence. They were offering me $2,000 a month in alimony. In exchange, I was to immediately and irrevocably surrender 100% of my equity in the logistics company I had built from the ground up. I was to walk away with nothing but a meager allowance that would barely cover rent in a bad neighborhood. I looked up from the paper, staring directly at Barbara, I asked her if this was some kind of sick joke. I reminded her that the company brought in millions a year and that my blood and sweat were poured into every single brick of our warehouses. I told her $2,000 a month was not a settlement, but a financial execution. Barbara did not even blink. She maintained her cold, radiant posture, refusing to show a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. Gavin laughed softly. It was a dry, scraping sound that echoed off the frosted glass walls of the conference room. He told me I was operating under the profound delusion that I still had leverage. He explained that I was no longer a business owner negotiating a sale, but rather a liability being liquidated. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany table. He lowered his voice into a menacing whisper. He said they were not asking for my permission or my blessing. They were giving me an ultimatum. He told me I was going to sign the surrender documents today because I had absolutely no other choice. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I asked him what he meant by an ultimatum. Gavin exchanged a triumphant look with Barbara before turning his dark eyes back to me. He revealed that while I was busy driving trucks and managing warehouse schedules, Barbara was busy managing my blind spots. He explained that she had spent the last 8 months quietly restructuring the executive board and isolating my controlling shares. And then he dropped the ultimate bomb. He announced that Barbara had successfully negotiated a massive under-the-table buyout of my entire logistics network. She was selling it to a massive private equity firm. The buyer was ready to gut the company, sell off the commercial fleet, and absorb the regional hubs. Gavin tapped his expensive watch with a perfectly manicured finger. He told me the deal was finalized and the ink was drying. He stated that the final transfer of ownership was scheduled to close today at exactly 12 noon. I had less than 3 hours before my empire was completely swallowed by a faceless corporation. The room spun around me. The air grew thin and I struggled to draw a breath. I looked at the paperwork again, flipping through the dense pages of the settlement. I told Gavin that a sale of that magnitude was legally impossible. I reminded him that my name was on the founding charter, and I was the primary shareholder. They could not sell the company without my explicit written consent on the initial financial disclosures. I demanded to see the preliminary contracts. Gavin did not hesitate for a second. He smoothly slid a secondary thin folder across the table. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were the preliminary disclosures and the intent to sell authorizations. I stared at the bottom of the last page. My signature was there. It was my exact handwriting capturing the slight loop I always put on the first letter of my name. But I had never seen this document in my life. I had never signed it. I looked at Barbara, and the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. She had forged my signature. She had spent 30 years learning every detail of my life, including how to perfectly replicate my handwriting. I threw the folder back onto the table. I told them this was blatant fraud. I raised my voice, pointing a shaking finger at Barbara. I accused her of forging my signature and committing a federal crime. I looked at Tyler, hoping to see a spark of recognition, hoping he would realize his mother was a criminal who was manipulating the law. But Tyler just looked away, swallowing hard and staring out the window at the city skyline. He knew. My own son knew about the forgery, and he was letting it happen. I turned back to Gavin with a burning sense of betrayal. I told him I would not sign the surrender documents. I threatened to call the police right from that room. I promised to take this to a judge and expose the entire fraudulent buyout to the authorities. I told them they were going to prison for wire fraud and forgery. I felt a surge of defiant energy rushing through my veins. I thought I had caught them in a fatal mistake. I thought I finally had the upper hand to stop the sale. But Gavin did not look scared. He did not look worried at all. He just smiled that cold, empty smile. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair and steepled his fingers again. He told me to go ahead and call the authorities. He invited me to hire a lawyer and take them to court. But then his voice dropped into a tone of absolute predatory certainty. He reminded me that the legal system is not designed to protect the righteous or the innocent. It is designed to protect the people with the most money. He told me that if I contested the divorce today, he would immediately freeze every single asset tied to my name. He promised to tie the company up in so much complex litigation that the private equity firm would walk away from the deal, leaving the business to completely collapse under the weight of the legal fees. He swore he would drag the divorce proceedings out for a decade. He promised to bury me under endless mountains of paperwork, injunctions, and appeals until I was completely broken. He looked at my cheap suit and my worn-out briefcase. He told me I would be bankrupt in 6 months. He said I would lose the house, the cars, and my pension. He warned me that I would spend the rest of my life fighting a battle I could never afford to win. He leaned forward, making sure I felt the full weight of his threat crushing down on me. He promised me that if I fought back, he would bury me in so much litigation that I would die of old age long before I ever saw the inside of a courtroom. He pointed to the pen resting next to the settlement document. He told me the $2,000 a month was not an offer, but a mercy I did not deserve. He told me to sign the paper and walk away with my life or fight them and lose absolutely everything. The heavy silence returned to the room, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I looked at the pen. I looked at my son, who had completely abandoned me. I looked at the woman I had loved for 30 years, who was now ready to destroy me. The trap had snapped shut, and I was bleeding out inside it, while the clock relentlessly ticked closer to noon. I stared at the pen resting on the polished mahogany table. It was just a simple piece of black plastic and silver metal, but it felt heavier than a loaded weapon. Gavin had laid out my execution with perfect, terrifying clarity. I slowly moved my eyes away from the threatening lawyer and looked at Barbara. I searched her face for even a fraction of a second of hesitation. I hoped to see some small trace of the woman I married 30 years ago. I hoped to find the woman who used to sit with me at our tiny kitchen table drinking cheap coffee and dreaming about building a business. But that woman was completely gone. In her place sat a stranger wrapped in designer clothes with a heart made of ice. I asked her how she could do this to our family. I asked her how she could poison our own son against me. Barbara let out a soft, dismissive breath. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms, looking at me as if I were a foolish child who simply did not understand how the real world worked. She told me I was being overly dramatic. She said it was not poison, but rather a necessary business calculation. She looked over at Tyler, who was still staring firmly at his lap, refusing to meet my gaze. Barbara smiled a cold, victorious smile. She explained that Tyler was not a victim of manipulation. She stated that Tyler had simply realized where his true future was located. She told me that the private equity firm buying the logistics network had made a very generous offer to secure a smooth transition. They wanted young, ambitious blood to help gut and restructure the regional hubs. Barbara revealed that as part of the secret acquisition deal, she had explicitly negotiated lucrative executive positions for Tyler and his wife Natalie. She had secured them massive corporate salaries complete with stock options, luxury company cars, and guaranteed golden parachutes. The words hit me harder than any physical blow could ever manage. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. She had not just lied to my son. She had bought him. She had literally purchased his loyalty with a corporate bribe. I looked at Tyler, pleading silently for him to deny it. I begged him to tell me it was a lie and that he had not sold out his own father for a shiny new title and a corner office. Tyler finally shifted in his seat. He slowly raised his head, but his eyes were completely hollow. He told me he had a family to think about now. He said Natalie was expecting their second child, and they could not wait around for me to slowly hand over the reins of a business that was stuck in the past. He claimed the buyout was the only way to guarantee his financial security. He said he was sorry, but it was just business. Just business. That phrase echoed in my mind, ringing like a funeral bell. He was talking about the company we built with our own hands. He was talking about the legacy I bled for, so he would never know the sting of poverty. And he dismissed it all as just business. A profound, suffocating despair settled over me. It was a dark, heavy blanket that smothered every last spark of hope I had left in my heart. I realized then that my son was truly gone. The boy I had raised had been replaced by a stranger who valued a corporate stock option more than his own father. My entire life had been a complete waste of time. I had sacrificed my health, my youth, and my peace of mind for a family that viewed me only as an asset to be liquidated. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the mediator. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a neutral gray suit and carrying an aura of professional detachment. He had been sitting quietly at the edge of the table taking notes on a yellow legal pad. He was completely oblivious to the massive fraud taking place right in front of his eyes. He did not know about the forged signatures or the secret private equity buyout. To him, this was just another messy, bitter divorce between wealthy people who hated each other. He cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at me with what he probably thought was a comforting and sympathetic expression. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his legal pad. He told me that divorce is always incredibly difficult and highly emotional. He stated that in his 20 years of mediating these kinds of disputes, he had seen anger completely destroy families and drain entire estates. He gently urged me to look at the situation logically. He explained that fighting a legal battle of this magnitude would take years of my life. He said it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and would likely result in a similar financial outcome anyway. He advised me to consider the emotional toll a prolonged court battle would take on my son and my grandchildren. He suggested that sometimes the bravest and most responsible thing a man can do is to simply let go. He pushed the settlement documents an inch closer to my hands. He gently encouraged me to sign the surrender papers today. He told me it would allow everyone to heal and move forward with their lives. His oblivious words were the final nail in my coffin. The man meant well, but his total ignorance of the situation felt like a cruel joke. He was asking me to facilitate my own robbery to keep the peace. He was telling me that giving up my life's work to a group of thieves was the responsible thing to do. The sheer injustice of it all paralyzed me. There was no one in this room who was on my side. I was completely surrounded by predators and blind officials. I looked back at the empty, emotionless face of my son and the smug, victorious sneer on my wife's face. Gavin Pierce watched me like a hawk, waiting for his prey to finally bleed out. I felt a crushing exhaustion pull at my muscles. I was 65 years old. My bones ached from decades of hard labor. My heart was completely shattered. I simply did not have the strength or the money to fight a massive corporate law firm. I did not have the energy to spend the next 10 years navigating a corrupt legal system only to lose my company anyway. I realized Gavin was right. They had outmaneuvered me. They had stolen my son, they had forged the documents, and they held all the cards. If I fought them, I would end up bankrupt and living on the street. If I signed, I would be poor and humiliated, but I would at least have enough money to buy food and rent a small, quiet room somewhere far away from them. The fight completely drained out of my body. It was a physical sensation like water rushing out of a cracked glass. My shoulders slumped forward. I dropped my gaze to the polished mahogany table, unable to look at the people who had destroyed my life for even one more second. I took a slow, trembling breath. The air tasted stale and metallic in my mouth. I slowly reached my calloused, scarred hand out toward the black plastic pen. My fingers hovered over it for a terrible, agonizing moment. I thought about the first delivery truck I ever bought. I thought about the long nights sleeping in warehouse offices. I thought about the pride I felt when Tyler first put on a company uniform. I closed my eyes tightly, pushing those memories away. They meant nothing anymore. They were just ghosts of a life that no longer existed. I lowered my fingers and grasped the cold, smooth plastic of the pen. It felt heavy in my grip. I slowly pulled the settlement documents closer to me. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. Barbara let out a small breath of relief. I could see the tension leaving Gavin's shoulders as he watched my hand move toward the signature line. Tyler finally looked up from his lap, watching me prepare to surrender his inheritance to strangers. I uncapped the pen. The small click echoed through the conference room. I placed the tip of the pen against the crisp white paper right above the line designated for my name. I prepared to sign away 30 years of my life and walk away into absolute nothingness. I felt completely broken and utterly defeated. I pressed the ink into the paper, ready to make the very first stroke of my signature. But right at that exact moment, a loud, sudden noise shattered the heavy silence of the room. The massive, heavy, frosted glass doors of the conference room swung open with a violent, dramatic crash. The heavy, frosted glass doors crashed against their metal stops with a sound like a physical blow. The sudden noise echoed through the massive conference room, shattering the suffocating silence that had just convinced me to sign away my life. I flinched, pulling my hand back from the settlement documents. The black plastic pen slipped from my grip and rolled harmlessly across the smooth mahogany table. The mediator jumped in his seat, nearly knocking over his legal pad. Tyler finally snapped his head up, looking toward the entrance with wide, startled eyes. Barbara let out a sharp gasp of indignation, clearly furious that her moment of absolute victory had been interrupted. I turned around in my chair, expecting to see a confused intern or a frantic legal assistant who had burst into the wrong room. Instead, I saw the elderly man from the commuter train. Winston stepped slowly over the threshold. He still wore the same tailored navy blue overcoat and held the same heavy leather briefcase he had dropped on the dirty floor of the train car. But something about him was entirely different now. In the sterile environment of that corporate high-rise building, he no longer looked like a fragile old man navigating a morning commute. He looked completely at home. He carried an aura of quiet, absolute authority that seemed to instantly drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He did not look rushed. He did not look apologetic for interrupting a private mediation. He just stood there observing the room with those sharp, pale blue eyes. Barbara was the first to react. She pushed her chair back and stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She raised her chin, adopting the haughty, demanding tone she reserved for customer service workers and anyone she considered beneath her. She opened her mouth to order the intruder out of the room. She began to say that this was a closed legal proceeding and demanded to know how he got past security. But the words literally died in her throat. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes locked onto Winston, and an expression of pure, unadulterated terror washed over her features. I watched in absolute shock as every single drop of color drained from her perfectly styled face. The smug, radiant confidence that had defined her posture for the last hour vanished in a fraction of a second. She collapsed back into her chair, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. She sat there pale and trembling, staring at the old man as if the Grim Reaper himself had just walked into the room. I looked over at Gavin Pierce, expecting the aggressive lawyer to jump up and demand security remove the stranger. Gavin was a man who made a living out of intimidating people. He had spent the last hour treating me like dirt on his shoe. But Gavin was not yelling. He was not threatening anyone with legal action. Gavin was staring at Winston with a look of absolute panic. The expensive silver pen he had been holding slipped right through his fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a loud clatter and rolled off the edge, hitting the floor. Gavin did not even try to pick it up. I looked closely and realized that the ruthless lawyer was physically shaking. His perfectly manicured hands were trembling so violently he had to press them flat against the table to try and hide it. He looked completely terrified. The confident predator who had threatened to bury me in litigation just moments ago was now sweating profusely. I looked back and forth between my terrified former wife and the frail old man from the train. I was completely bewildered. I could not comprehend what was happening. Just moments ago, Barbara and Gavin were the undisputed masters of the universe, holding my entire life and legacy in the palm of their hands. They had orchestrated a masterful fraud and bought my son away from me. They had been untouchable. Yet the mere physical presence of this elderly commuter had reduced them both to trembling, silent messes. The shift in power was so sudden and so violent, it gave me whiplash. I looked at Tyler, who was equally confused. He glanced at his mother, seeking some sort of explanation, but Barbara was completely paralyzed. She could not speak. She could not even look away from the old man standing by the door. The entire dynamic of the room had shifted irrevocably without a single word being spoken. The heavy, crushing despair that had forced me to pick up the pen was slowly being replaced by a deep, gripping curiosity. I realized that the man I had helped on the train was not just a random stranger. He was someone who possessed a terrifying amount of power over the people trying to destroy me. The silence stretched out, becoming incredibly thick and heavy. No one dared to breathe. The sound of the city traffic far below the windows was the only thing breaking the quiet. Finally, Gavin tried to break the tension. He scrambled to his feet so fast his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the floor. He tried to plaster on a respectful, accommodating smile, but it looked more like a grimace of pain. He smoothed his suit jacket with shaking hands and cleared his throat loudly. He attempted to stammer out a greeting. His voice was high and tight, completely lacking its usual arrogant smoothness. He welcomed the old man to the office and frantically attempted to apologize for the mess on the table. He said they were just concluding a very minor personal matter and promised they would clear the room immediately. He sounded like a panicked subordinate caught stealing office supplies by the chief executive. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of control. But Winston did not even acknowledge Gavin was speaking. He did not look at the lawyer. He did not offer a nod or a word of greeting in return. Winston treated the powerful, aggressive attorney as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. The old man simply continued walking. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing loudly in the silent room. He walked right past Gavin, completely ignoring the stammering apologies and the trembling hands. He moved with a quiet, terrifying purpose toward the head of the massive mahogany table. Barbara shrank back in her chair as Winston approached. She looked like she wanted to sink into the floor and disappear entirely. Winston stopped at the head of the table right next to where she sat. He slowly and deliberately placed his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished wood. The dull thud of the leather hitting the table made Barbara flinch. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white. Winston unbuttoned his navy blue overcoat, taking his time. He was commanding the entire room just by existing within it. The mediator looked completely lost, clutching his legal pad to his chest, not knowing if he should speak or remain silent. Tyler watched with wide eyes, absorbing the bizarre scene unfolding before him. I sat frozen in my chair, my hand still hovering near the unsigned settlement document. I looked down at the forged paperwork that was supposed to end my life. I looked back up at the elderly man who was now standing at the head of the table, radiating absolute authority. I did not know who this old man really was or what kind of power he wielded. But looking at the sheer, unadulterated terror on the faces of the people who had just tried to ruin me, I knew one thing for certain. The execution was officially canceled. The tables had turned, and the real reckoning was about to begin. Winston did not rush to speak. He let the heavy, terrifying silence stretch out, letting Barbara and Gavin stew in their own mounting panic. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his tailored navy blue overcoat. His movements were deliberate and practiced. He pulled out a pair of silver reading glasses and slid them onto his face. The transformation was complete. He was no longer the frail elderly commuter who had dropped his bags on a dirty train floor. He was a titan of industry preparing to dismantle an entire room with a few carefully chosen words. He looked down the length of the polished mahogany table, letting his pale blue eyes settle directly on Barbara. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet even further. He finally broke the silence, and his voice was completely steady, carrying a low, resonant power that commanded absolute attention. He told her she was looking very pale today. He asked her if the stress of a multi-million-dollar acquisition was finally catching up to her. Barbara tried to speak. She opened her mouth and let out a small, weak sound that was closer to a whimper than a word. She gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were completely white, but she could not force a coherent sentence past her lips. Gavin finally managed to scrape together a few scraps of his ruined professional pride. He cleared his throat again, sounding completely desperate. He attempted to formally address the old man, calling him Mr. Carmichael. He stammered that they were incredibly honored by his unexpected presence, but gently suggested that perhaps this was not the most appropriate venue for a personal visit. He tried to claim they were just wrapping up a minor familial dispute and promised to meet him in the executive boardroom downstairs in 10 minutes. The name hit me like a physical blow. Carmichael. I repeated the name softly under my breath, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. I looked at the old man, and the pieces finally snapped together in my mind. Winston Carmichael. He was the founder and the absolute head of Carmichael Industries. He was the chairman of the massive private equity firm that Barbara was secretly selling my logistics network to. He was the invisible buyer, the man with the $50 million check who was supposed to swallow my life's work at noon today. Winston slowly turned his head to look at Gavin. He did not raise his voice, but the cold fury in his tone made the arrogant lawyer visibly shrink back in his chair. Winston told Gavin to close his mouth and keep it closed. He stated that the only reason he was allowing Gavin to remain in the room was because he wanted a front row seat to his inevitable disbarment. Gavin instantly snapped his mouth shut, dropping his gaze to the table like a scolded dog. Winston turned his attention back to Barbara. He placed both hands flat on his heavy leather briefcase resting on the table. He told her he had a fascinating morning. He explained that he possessed a personal habit that drove his board of directors absolutely crazy. He revealed that despite his vast wealth, he still took the morning commuter train into the city twice a week. He explained that corporate boardrooms and luxury town cars isolate a man from reality. He said the only way to truly understand the pulse of a city and the character of everyday people is to sit among them when they think no one important is watching. He looked over at me and offered a small, genuine nod of respect before turning back to Barbara. He told her that this morning on the 7:15 inbound train he dropped his briefcase. He said documents scattered everywhere and no one moved to help him except one exhausted man in a cheap suit. He explained that the man did not know who he was or what kind of power he wielded. He said the man just saw someone who needed a hand and stepped in without hesitation. He told Barbara that he and this man got to talking during the commute. He revealed that the man was heartbroken, not just because his business was being stolen, but because his own family had been poisoned against him. Winston leaned forward slightly, letting his sharp gaze pierce right through Barbara's crumbling facade. He told her he was scheduled to arrive at this very building at noon today to personally sign off on the $50 million acquisition of a thriving regional logistics network. He stated that the paperwork had been vetted and the capital was ready to be transferred. But he said he did not realize until 45 minutes ago, while sitting on a moving train, that the company he was buying was being actively stolen from the very man who actually built it. Barbara finally found a fractured piece of her voice. She scrambled to salvage her professional image, desperately trying to reframe the narrative. She forced a rigid, trembling smile onto her face. She called him Mr. Carmichael and stammered that there had clearly been a profound misunderstanding. She insisted the company was fully prepared for a smooth and legal transition. She claimed the divorce mediation was a separate, highly emotional matter that was regrettably clouding the business realities. She begged him to let her explain the restructuring plan, assuring him that the logistics network would be fully operational under the new corporate umbrella by the end of the week. Winston did not smile back. He looked at her with a level of cold, absolute disdain that I had never seen before. He told her he did not care about her restructuring plans. He stated that he did not do business with thieves And he absolutely did not tolerate fraud within his acquisitions. He told her she had manufactured a false narrative and manipulated her own family to secure a payout. He said her entire strategy was built on a foundation of lies and forged documents. He made it perfectly clear that he was not there to listen to her excuses or renegotiate a broken deal. He was there to ensure she understood the catastrophic consequences of her actions. The air in the room felt electric. The crushing despair that had paralyzed me just moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a surging tide of righteous validation. The untouchable predator who had threatened to bury me in endless litigation was now the one backed into a corner. Barbara was staring down the barrel of total financial and professional ruin delivered by the very man she had tried to sell my legacy to. Winston Carmichael had not just stopped the execution. He had completely rewritten the rules of engagement, and the real dismantling of Barbara's fraudulent empire was just beginning. Gavin Pierce desperately wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. The immaculate and terrifying facade of the ruthless corporate lawyer was melting away right in front of my eyes. He swallowed hard, adjusting his silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. He forced his hands to stop trembling and slapped them flat against the polished mahogany table. He tried to project the commanding presence he had used to terrorize me just 10 minutes earlier, but his voice cracked as he spoke. He insisted to Winston that everything happening in this room was perfectly legal. He claimed the buyout documents had been thoroughly vetted by 3 different independent law firms. He stated that the initial financial disclosures were properly signed and notarized, and that the transfer of assets was operating under standard corporate procedure. He frantically tried to build a wall of legal jargon around himself and Barbara, assuring the billionaire that there was absolutely no financial exposure for Carmichael Industries. Winston Carmichael let him talk. He stood at the head of the table, radiating an intense, overwhelming calm. He watched the desperate lawyer spin his web of excuses with the mild, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a rat trapped in a maze. When Gavin finally ran out of breath, Winston simply unlatched the heavy brass locks of his genuine leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out the exact same thick, glossy folder that had slipped under my shoe on the commuter train. Winston tossed the folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud right on top of Gavin's predatory settlement offer. Winston opened the cover and began to methodically lay out the acquisition blueprints. The large architectural schematics and dense legal addendums spread across the dark wood, completely covering the divorce papers. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply pointed a steady finger at a highlighted paragraph buried deep within the 3rd page of the preliminary contract. He told Gavin to read Section 4, Paragraph 2 out loud. Gavin leaned forward. His eyes darted nervously across the page. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Winston did not wait for him to find his courage. The older man recited the clause entirely from memory. He stated that the acquisition was strictly contingent upon the seller providing a clean and unencumbered chain of title for all corporate assets. He explained that a clean chain of title meant there were no hidden liens, no undisclosed debts, and absolutely no contested ownership disputes. He looked directly at Barbara, whose eyes were wide with mounting horror. Winston explained that the $50 million valuation was based entirely on the premise that Barbara had the sole undisputed legal authority to sell the logistics network. He pointed a sharp accusing finger at the divorce settlement sitting under the blueprints. He told them that hiding a hostile active divorce proceeding during a corporate acquisition was a material breach of contract. He stated that deliberately concealing my status as the primary founding shareholder was not just a minor clerical error. It was a calculated attempt to defraud an investment firm out of $50 million. Barbara let out a frantic, sobbing gasp. She desperately tried to distance herself from the massive legal fallout. She pointed a shaking finger at her own lawyer. She cried out that Gavin had handled all the paperwork and that she was just following his legal advice. She claimed she did not understand the corporate requirements and that Gavin told her the signatures would hold up in court. Gavin whipped his head around, staring at his client with pure, unadulterated hatred. The alliance they had formed to destroy my life was beginning to disintegrate under the immense pressure of their own crimes. Winston silenced them both by bringing his hand down hard against the table. The sudden noise made everyone in the room flinch. He told them that he did not care which one of them came up with the idea. He stated that the forged intent to sell authorizations crossed his desk an hour ago. He looked at Gavin with a gaze so piercing it could cut through solid steel. He told the lawyer that forging a signature on a local real estate deed was a state crime that might get him a slap on the wrist. But forging a signature on a corporate disclosure document to facilitate a $50 million buyout from a national investment firm was an entirely different beast. Winston leaned forward, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. He told them they had transmitted fraudulent financial projections across state lines to his corporate headquarters. He said they had routed forged signatures through digital servers to secure interstate capital. He explained that by using digital communications to execute a massive financial deception, they had not just played dirty in family court. They had committed textbook federal wire fraud. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Federal wire fraud. It was a charge that carried decades in a maximum security prison. It was a charge that seized assets, froze bank accounts, and completely ruined lives. I sat perfectly still, watching the incredible spectacle of my tormentors facing their own absolute destruction. I had felt completely powerless an hour ago, but now I was watching the very mechanisms of their greed turn into a trap they could not escape. I realized that the meticulous paperwork they had used to corner me was now the exact weapon Winston was using to dismantle them. Gavin was a cornered animal. He was sweating so profusely his expensive collar was completely soaked. He desperately tried to find a legal loophole to save his career and his freedom. He pushed himself up from the table, leaning aggressively toward Winston. He argued loudly that the jurisdiction was entirely wrong. He insisted that the initial disclosures were signed within state lines and governed strictly by local corporate law. He claimed that because the funds had not officially transferred yet, no actual financial damage had occurred. He argued that it was a family dispute that should be handled by a local civil judge and not a federal prosecutor. He frantically tried to minimize the crime, telling Winston that his lawyers could simply withdraw the acquisition offer and walk away without pressing charges. He begged Winston to consider this a simple misunderstanding that could be erased by tearing up the contracts. Winston actually smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that offered absolutely no mercy. He told Gavin that his understanding of corporate compliance was embarrassingly inadequate. He stated that the moment Gavin transmitted the forged documents to the firm, the crime was fully committed regardless of whether the money had moved. He told the sweating lawyer that Carmichael Industries did not simply walk away when someone attempted to steal $50 million from their investors. He explained that overlooking fraud of this magnitude would make him complicit, and he had not built a global empire by protecting small-time thieves. Winston reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He placed it gently on top of the forged settlement papers. He informed Gavin and Barbara that he did not travel to finalize acquisitions alone. He stated that he had a corporate compliance team composed of former federal prosecutors and forensic accountants. He revealed that his entire team was currently sitting in a black Suburban parked directly downstairs outside the main lobby. He told them his team was already drafting the referral for the federal authorities and coordinating with local law enforcement to pull the digital transmission logs directly from Gavin's law firm servers. He made it completely clear that there was no local judge who could save them and no legal maneuver that could undo the trap they had built for themselves. The walls had completely closed in, and they had absolutely nowhere left to run. The reality of federal prison is not a concept that registers immediately. It is a heavy, suffocating weight that takes a few long moments to truly crush the air out of a room. I watched that crushing reality settle over Barbara and Gavin Pierce. The confident, arrogant predators who had spent the past year meticulously planning my financial execution were completely paralyzed. The threat of a corporate compliance team sitting just 40 floors below us pulling digital transmission logs and preparing federal warrants, acted like a sledgehammer against their fragile alliance. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves when the sirens start approaching. The polished, unified front they had presented to the mediator completely evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. Barbara was the very first to break. Her survival instinct completely overrode any sense of dignity or professional decorum she had left. She pushed her heavy leather chair back so violently she stumbled away from the table as if the forged documents sitting there had suddenly caught fire. She turned her panicked, wide eyes entirely onto Gavin. She raised a shaking finger and pointed it directly at the man she had hired to destroy me. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing loudly off the frosted glass walls of the conference room. She cried out to Winston that it was not her idea. She frantically claimed she did not understand corporate law or complex acquisition protocols. She desperately painted herself as a vulnerable, naive woman who was simply following the aggressive legal counsel of her attorney. She swore to the billionaire that she never wanted to forge my signature on the initial disclosures. She stated that Gavin had specifically instructed her to replicate my handwriting. She claimed he promised her it was a standard legal workaround to expedite the asset transfer before the divorce was finalized. Gavin looked at her with a mixture of absolute disgust and pure, unadulterated rage. The expensive, custom-tailored suit he wore could no longer hide the fact that he was now fighting for his own freedom. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He slammed his hands flat against the polished mahogany table, refusing to be the sacrificial lamb for her boundless greed. He shouted back at her, calling her a pathetic, manipulative liar. He told Winston not to listen to a single word she was saying. He insisted he was a highly respected corporate attorney and would never under any circumstances advise a client to commit federal wire fraud. He scrambled to reach into his own leather briefcase, pulling out a sleek silver tablet. His fingers were trembling so violently, he fumbled with the screen-locking mechanism before finally opening it. He swiped frantically through his digital files, desperate to present his own defense. Gavin slammed the tablet onto the table, pushing it toward the center. He loudly declared that he kept meticulous records of every single client interaction precisely to protect himself from treacherous individuals like Barbara. He opened an email thread and began to read it aloud. His voice was shaking with fury, but the words were completely damning. He read a message Barbara had sent him exactly 4 months ago. In her own words, Barbara had outlined the entire timeline of the theft. She explicitly instructed Gavin to delay the divorce filings until she could secure the private equity offer. She wrote that she needed to physically lock me out of the company servers so I could not see the financial audits being conducted by the buyers. Gavin scrolled to the next message and read it with venomous satisfaction. In it, Barbara had explicitly asked what the legal repercussions would be if my signature miraculously appeared on the preliminary intent to sell documents. Gavin did not stop there. He wanted to ensure Barbara went down completely and took the full brunt of the federal investigation. He read a third email where she coldly detailed her plan to turn our son Tyler against me. She had written that Tyler was sentimental and might try to side with his father if he knew the truth about the buyout. She orchestrated the lie about me selling the company specifically to secure his silence and his cooperation. The emails proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Barbara was not a naive victim following bad legal advice. She was the master architect of the entire conspiracy. She had meticulously calculated every single move to maximize my pain and her own financial gain. The entire room listened to her cruel typed words being broadcast into the open air. Barbara lost whatever shred of sanity she had left. She lunged forward across the table, screaming at Gavin to shut his mouth. She accused him of altering the digital files to save himself. She yelled that he was a terrible lawyer who had promised her a clean victory and instead delivered a federal investigation. Gavin yelled right back, matching her volume and her vitriol. He called her a greedy, delusional woman who had ruined her own family and was now trying to ruin his entire career. They screamed at each other, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, desperate symphony of panic. They hurled insults and accusations, throwing every piece of dirty laundry they had collected over the past year into the open. They were two drowning people desperately trying to push the other one under the water just so they could catch a single breath of air. The mediator sat completely frozen in his chair, looking horrified at the massive legal and ethical violations unfolding right in front of him. Winston Carmichael stood calmly at the head of the table, observing the absolute destruction of their alliance with cold, detached satisfaction. And I just sat there. I did not raise my voice. I did not jump up to defend myself or demand apologies. I remained perfectly chillingly silent. I simply leaned back in my chair, resting my calloused hands on my lap, and watched them tear each other apart. For months, Barbara had controlled the narrative. She had controlled my access to my own money. She had controlled the mind of my son. I had spent countless sleepless nights desperately trying to figure out how to make people listen to the truth. I had exhausted myself trying to find the right words to defend my honor. But sitting there in that massive corporate conference room, I realized the most profound truth of my entire life. I did not need to say a single word. I did not need to argue or plead or explain myself to anyone. My silence was infinitely more powerful than any defense I could have ever mounted. By simply doing nothing, I was allowing them to destroy their own credibility completely and permanently. Every scream, every accusation, every panicked revelation they hurled at each other was another nail in their own coffins. They were doing all of my work for me. They were exposing the depth of their deception in front of the private equity billionaire they had tried to defraud. They were exposing their malice in front of the mediator who was supposed to rule on our divorce. And most importantly, they were exposing their true monstrous nature right in front of the son they had manipulated. I watched Barbara's face contort with ugly, desperate rage, and I felt the last lingering ghost of my love for her simply vanish. The woman screaming across the table was not my wife. She was just a thief caught in the act fighting for her life. And I was finally truly free from her. The deafening noise of the screaming match between Barbara and the lawyer filled the massive conference room, but for Tyler, the sound slowly faded into a dull, distant roar. My son sat completely frozen in his expensive leather chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. His eyes were not fixed on his enraged mother or the sweating attorney. His gaze was locked entirely onto the sleek silver tablet resting in the center of the table. The screen was still glowing brightly, displaying the email thread that Gavin had maliciously pulled up to save his own skin. From where Tyler sat, the words were perfectly legible. He could see his own name typed out in crisp black letters across the digital screen. He could read the exact sentences where the woman who had given birth to him cold-bloodedly described him as a sentimental liability. He read how she meticulously outlined her strategy to manipulate his emotions and twist his loyalty just to secure a massive financial payout. I watched my son process the utter destruction of his reality. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking pale and profoundly sick. For the past 8 months, he had believed every single lie Barbara had fed him. He had listened to her late-night phone calls where she cried fake tears and claimed I was planning to abandon the family. He had reviewed the fabricated financial spreadsheets Gavin had presented to him showing a fictitious corporate liquidation. Tyler had believed them because the concept of his own mother manufacturing such a monstrous deception was entirely incomprehensible to him. He had trusted her unconditionally. He had allowed her toxic words to completely sever the bond we had spent 30 years building. He had ignored my phone calls and turned his back on the man who had taught him how to ride a bicycle and manage a shipping warehouse. The heavy burden of guilt suddenly crashed over him. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped and the way his hands trembled as he continued to stare at the glowing screen. He realized that the man he had hated for the better part of a year was completely innocent. He understood that the father he thought was selling his future to the highest bidder was actually the one trying to protect him from a group of ruthless predators. Tyler slowly lifted his head away from the tablet and looked directly at his mother. Barbara was completely unhinged, throwing wild accusations at Gavin and desperately trying to salvage her ruined reputation in front of the private equity billionaire. Tyler looked at the woman who had raised him and realized he did not recognize her at all. The caring, supportive mother was a complete illusion. In her place stood a greedy, manipulative stranger who viewed her own child as nothing more than a strategic pawn on a corporate chessboard. Tyler finally moved. He pushed his heavy chair back and slowly stood up. The scraping sound of the chair against the marble floor drew no attention at first, because Barbara and Gavin were too busy trying to destroy each other. Tyler took a deep breath and spoke. He did not yell. He did not match the frantic, chaotic energy vibrating through the conference room. His voice was remarkably calm and steady, but it carried a profound weight that instantly cut through the noise. He called out to his mother, asking her if it was all true. He asked her if she really forged the legal documents and fabricated the entire story about the buyout just to steal the logistics company. Barbara stopped screaming at the lawyer and whipped her head around to look at her son. For a brief second, a flash of genuine panic crossed her face. She frantically tried to put the mask of the loving mother back on, but it was completely shattered beyond repair. She forced a rigid, desperate smile and took a step toward him. She told Tyler he simply did not understand the complexities of corporate business. She claimed she did all of this specifically for him and his pregnant wife, Natalie. She insisted she was securing their future and protecting the family legacy from my supposed incompetence. She begged him to sit down and promised that everything would make sense once the transition was fully complete. Tyler did not sit down. He stood his ground and asked her the question again. He demanded to know if she had lied to him about his father. He asked if she had deliberately turned him against me just to secure a clean chain of title for her secret $50 million deal. The calm, persistent questioning finally broke the last remaining shred of Barbara's composure. The fake maternal smile vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of ugly, desperate fury. She lost her temper completely. She treated my 30-year-old son like a disobedient toddler throwing a tantrum. She screamed at him to sit down and be quiet. She ordered him to stop asking foolish questions and let the adults handle the complex legal matters. Her voice grew more shrill and demanding as she tried to force him back into submission. She pointed a shaking finger at him and told him not to ruin the massive corporate salaries and the lucrative stock options she had personally secured for his future. She demanded he remember his loyalty to her and ordered him to stop acting like a sentimental fool. She tried to use the promise of immense wealth to place the puppet strings back onto his arms. She expected him to simply bow his head, obey her commands, and accept the blood money she was offering him. She believed that greed would ultimately conquer his conscience, just as it had completely consumed hers. Tyler looked at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. He realized that she genuinely believed money could buy anything, including his love and his integrity. He slowly looked down at the heavy settlement document resting on the polished wood directly in front of his empty chair. It was his copy of the surrender agreement, the exact paperwork designed to finalize my total financial execution. Tyler reached out and placed his hand flat against the thick, crisp paper. He did not tear it up or throw it across the room. He simply pushed it. He slowly slid the heavy document all the way across the smooth mahogany table, sending it back to the sweating attorney. He looked his mother dead in the eye and told her he did not want her dirty money. He stated clearly that he wanted absolutely no part of a stolen company or a fraudulent legacy. The room fell perfectly silent as the magnitude of his rejection hung in the air. Tyler turned away from the head of the table, completely turning his back on the woman who had manipulated him and the wealth she had tried to use to control him. He walked slowly and deliberately across the massive conference room. Every footstep echoed loudly in the heavy silence. He walked past the terrified lawyer and past his enraged, humiliated mother. He walked directly toward the opposite end of the long mahogany table where I was sitting. He stopped right behind my chair. I felt the comforting warmth of his presence instantly settle over me. Tyler reached out and placed his hand firmly on the back of my chair. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it was the loudest and most powerful statement made in the entire building today. He did not need to offer a lengthy apology or explain his regret right then. The physical action spoke volumes. The family loyalty had shifted permanently and irrevocably. I reached up and gently placed my calloused hand over his. I felt a single tear escape my eye and roll slowly down my weathered cheek. I had lost my 30-year marriage, and my life savings were still hanging in the balance of a chaotic legal dispute. But sitting there with my son standing firmly behind me, protecting my back, I knew I had already won the only victory that truly mattered in this world. Winston Carmichael buttoned his tailored navy blue overcoat with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who had just finished a very disappointing day of work. He looked at the trembling lawyer and the terrified woman sitting at the long mahogany table. He spoke with a voice that carried the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. He formally announced that Carmichael Industries was officially withdrawing its offer to acquire the logistics network. He stated that the $50 million capital transfer had been canceled and that his compliance team was already packing up their equipment downstairs. He told Barbara she had played a very dangerous game with other people's money and she had lost everything. He explained that she was now holding a fraudulent company she had absolutely no idea how to operate. He reminded her that the trucks still needed to run, the regional hubs still required complex daily management, and the supply chains would completely collapse without the founder steering the ship. He pointed out that she had alienated the only two men who actually understood the business. He told her she was left with a massive impending federal investigation, crushing legal debts from a lawyer who could not save her and a corporate empire that would bleed her dry in less than 6 months. Winston turned his pale blue eyes toward me, offering a final nod of profound respect before he slowly walked out of the massive glass doors, leaving the wreckage of Barbara's ambition burning in his wake. The heavy glass doors closed with a soft click, sealing the remaining 4 of us inside the silent room. The mediator sat perfectly still, clearly terrified to make a single sudden movement. Gavin stared blankly at the spot where the billionaire had been standing, his legal career evaporating before his eyes. Barbara sat slumped in her expensive chair, completely hollowed out. Her flawless posture was gone. Her radiant, smug confidence had been replaced by the devastating realization that she was entirely alone. I felt the steady, comforting pressure of Tyler standing right behind my chair. My son, resting his hand on the back of my seat, gave me a surge of incredible strength. For the past hour, I had been the victim of a calculated ambush. I had been told to sit down, keep quiet, and accept my financial execution. But I was no longer the tired, defeated old man who walked into this high-rise building. I took a deep, steady breath and finally broke the silence I had maintained since the old man walked into the room. I reached down and picked up my scuffed imitation leather briefcase. The cheap metal clasps snapped open, echoing loudly in the quiet conference room. I did not rush. I employed the exact same terrifying patience Winston had just demonstrated. I slowly reached inside the battered bag, bypassing the useless defense notes I had been reviewing on the morning train. I pulled out a single crisp document encased in a plain manila folder. I placed it gently onto the polished wood, right next to Gavin's predatory settlement offer. I looked directly at Barbara and told her that she made one critical mistake in her elaborate plan. I explained that she assumed my calloused hands meant I was a simple, uneducated laborer who only knew how to drive trucks. I reminded her that I built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire from a single rusted van because I knew how to track every single detail of a complex system. I told her I started noticing the discrepancies weeks ago. I noticed when the automatic payments for the warehouse leases were suddenly delayed. I saw the subtle changes in the routing numbers and the missing quarterly financial reports that Gavin had tried to bury. I told her I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the numbers long before she handed me the divorce papers. I explained that while she was busy trying to isolate my controlling shares and poison my son against me, I was quietly sitting at my small kitchen table drafting a contingency plan. I pushed the manila folder across the smooth mahogany surface until it came to a rest, directly in front of her trembling hands. I told her this was the only document that mattered in this room today. It was a comprehensive counter-settlement I had drafted with a quiet, unassuming family lawyer the moment I realized my wife was planning to rob me blind. Gavin Pierce reacted purely on reflex. His survival instinct kicked in, and he desperately tried to resurrect his aggressive corporate persona. He lunged forward, reaching out to grab the manila folder before Barbara could even look at it. He pushed the document back toward me, sliding it across the table with a trembling, sweaty hand. He raised his voice, trying to inject authority back into his tone, but he sounded frantic and weak. He insisted that the new document was completely unacceptable and legally irrelevant. He stammered that they were not prepared to review unverified counteroffers and claimed my paperwork was not binding. He tried to argue that the original settlement was still the only viable path forward and demanded that we return to the established mediation protocol. He desperately wanted to remain relevant, to pretend he still had some shred of control over the catastrophic situation. I did not even blink. I raised my hand and stopped the sliding folder flat against the wood. I looked at the sweating attorney with absolute cold detachment. I told Gavin to close his mouth and step away from the table. I informed him that his services were no longer required and his legal opinions were completely worthless to me. I stated very clearly that I was no longer negotiating with legal counsel. I turned my eyes away from the disgraced lawyer and locked my gaze entirely onto Barbara. I told my former wife that the time for negotiations had ended the exact second she forged my signature on a federal disclosure document. I explained that she was a woman staring down the barrel of a federal wire fraud indictment, with a business she was incapable of running, and a lawyer who was about to be disbarred. I leaned forward, making sure she felt the absolute crushing weight of my words. I told Barbara I was not asking for a compromise. I was dictating the final unconditional terms of her total surrender. I placed my calloused hand flat against the manila folder, pushing it the last few inches until it bumped gently against Barbara's folded hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet certainty in my tone carried more weight than any scream or threat ever could. I told my former wife to open the folder and read the terms of her absolute surrender. Barbara hesitated. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she reached out and flipped open the plain cover. She stared at the crisp white pages of the counter-settlement I had drafted with a quiet, unassuming family lawyer weeks ago. I watched her eyes dart across the paragraphs, trying to process the magnitude of what she was reading. I told her I would save her the trouble of translating the legal jargon and lay out the terms perfectly cleanly. I stated that I would retain 100% of my logistics company. I would keep all commercial assets, the regional hubs, and every single delivery truck in the fleet. I explained that I would also maintain total control over my personal investments and the retirement pension I had spent 30 years building. I looked directly at her, ensuring she understood that her financial execution was not a negotiation. I told her that in exchange for her complete forfeiture of any future claims against my estate, she would take her personal bank accounts and the massive suburban house we had lived in. That was it. There would be absolutely no alimony, no spousal support, and no hidden corporate buyouts to fund her luxurious lifestyle. She was walking away with exactly what she had right now and not a single penny more. Barbara let out a sharp, frantic gasp. The reality of the catastrophic situation finally pierced through her thick armor of denial. She looked up from the papers, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She cried out that the terms were completely impossible. She claimed the property taxes on the massive suburban estate were exorbitant, and the maintenance costs were astronomical. She desperately tried to appeal to my sense of duty, pointing out that she had grown accustomed to a certain standard of living. She argued that without the $2,000 a month in alimony, she would be completely bankrupt within a year. She insisted she would not be able to afford the house she had demanded, and would be forced to sell it at a devastating loss. I looked at the woman I had loved for 3 decades and felt absolutely nothing. I told her that her inability to afford her own lifestyle was no longer my problem. I reminded her that she had spent the last year orchestrating a massive corporate fraud, turning my own son against me and trying to steal my life's work. I explained that she had gambled everything on a secret $50 million payout, and she had lost spectacularly. I told her that selling the house and downsizing to a smaller apartment was a fitting consequence for her boundless greed. I leaned forward, making sure she understood that the days of me financing her destructive ambition were permanently over. Barbara's desperation turned into a frantic, ugly defiance. The tears vanished, replaced by a rigid, trembling fury. She slammed her hand against the polished mahogany table and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She threatened to tear the counter-settlement into pieces. She screamed that she would never sign such a predatory agreement. She promised to take the entire divorce to a judge and fight me in open court. She claimed she would hire a new legal team and drag the proceedings out for years, just as Gavin had originally threatened. She swore she would bleed the company dry with injunctions and appeals until there was absolutely nothing left for anyone to inherit. She was a cornered animal lashing out with the only weapons she thought she still had left. The heavy, tense silence in the room was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. Winston Carmichael was standing calmly at the head of the long table. He was using a gold pen to gently tap the stack of forged acquisition blueprints he had laid out earlier. The soft metallic clicks drew everyone's attention immediately. He did not look at Barbara with anger or frustration. He looked at her with the cold, detached calculation of a predator evaluating its trapped prey. He told her she was operating under a profound delusion regarding her current legal standing. He explained that if she walked out of this conference room without signing John's settlement, she would not be heading to a civil family court. Winston picked up this forged intent to sell authorizations. He held the documents up, letting the crisp paper catch the cold, fluorescent light. He reminded her that his corporate compliance team was sitting in a black Suburban 40 floors below us, pulling the digital transmission logs from Gavin's servers. He promised her that if she refused my terms, he would personally hand his complete forensic audit directly to the federal district attorney before the end of the day. He stated very clearly that a federal prosecutor would not care about her property taxes or her standard of living. He told her she would be indicted for wire fraud forgery and attempted corporate theft. He promised her that the federal government would freeze every single asset she owned, seize the suburban house as evidence, and throw her into a maximum security prison for the next 2 decades. Winston leaned forward, resting his hands on his heavy leather briefcase. He lowered his voice into a terrifyingly calm register. He told Barbara she was no longer negotiating a divorce settlement. She was negotiating her physical freedom. He informed her she had exactly 2 choices left in this world. She could sign John's terms, surrender her claims, and walk out of the building a poor but free woman. Or she could refuse the offer and spend the rest of her natural life fighting a federal prosecution she could never afford to win. He tapped the forged documents one last time, promising her that if she chose to fight, Carmichael Industries would dedicate its entire legal department to ensuring she never saw the outside of a prison cell again. The ultimatum hung in the air, a cold, terrifying reality that completely crushed Barbara's final desperate attempt at defiance. The reality of the threat hung in the cold air of the massive conference room. There was no escape hatch left to open, and no legal loophole left to exploit. Winston Carmichael had laid out the absolute end of the road. Barbara stared at the billionaire as the sheer gravity of a federal indictment finally crushed the last remaining breath of her defiance. The choice was no longer about preserving a luxurious lifestyle or securing a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout. The choice was simply between complete financial surrender and spending the rest of her natural life locked inside a federal prison. I sat quietly in my chair and watched the absolute terror take full possession of my former wife. Her flawless posture completely collapsed. The elegant navy dress that had looked so perfectly tailored an hour ago now seemed like a heavy costume draped over a broken woman. Her shoulders slumped forward, and she seemed to physically shrink under the harsh fluorescent lights. The smug, radiant confidence she had carried into the room had been entirely replaced by a desperate, suffocating panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely dry. No words came out. She just let out a shallow, ragged breath. She looked around the expansive room, desperately seeking a single friendly face or a shred of sympathy. She found absolutely nothing. The mediator remained frozen in his seat, clutching his legal pad and refusing to make eye contact. Tyler stood firmly behind me, a silent wall of judgment and rejection. Winston watched her with the cold, detached patience of an executioner waiting for a signature. She was entirely, completely alone. The only person who moved was Gavin Pierce, the ruthless, aggressive corporate lawyer who had promised to bury me in endless litigation, was now desperately trying to save his own skin. He did not look at Barbara or offer his client a single word of comfort. His survival instinct had completely overridden his professional obligations. Gavin reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and began gathering his scattered documents. He moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy that was pathetic to witness. He shoved the forged preliminary contracts and his expensive legal tablet into his heavy leather briefcase. He fumbled with the brass latches, his fingers shaking so violently he could barely close them. The loud metallic clicking sounds echoed sharply in the silent room, highlighting the absolute disgrace of his retreat. He did not say a word to me. He did not dare to look at Winston Carmichael. Gavin simply grabbed the handle of his briefcase and stood up. He kept his head lowered, staring firmly at the polished marble floor. The man who had walked into the mediation, expecting to orchestrate a masterful $50 million theft, was now slinking away like a beaten dog. He walked briskly toward the heavy frosted glass doors, desperate to escape the room before the federal authorities officially arrived. The heavy doors swung open and closed behind him, leaving a hollow ringing sound in his wake. Gavin was gone, leaving Barbara completely defenseless and utterly exposed to the consequences of her own boundless greed. Barbara watched her lawyer abandon her, and a fresh wave of panic washed over her pale face. She slowly turned her eyes back to the plain manila folder resting on the polished mahogany table right in front of her. The counter-settlement I had drafted with a quiet family lawyer was the only thing standing between her and a federal prison sentence. She stared at the crisp white pages as if they were covered in poison. She knew that signing that document meant forfeiting every single claim to my life, savings, my investments, and the logistics company I had built with my own two hands. It meant accepting a massive, humiliating defeat. But the alternative was simply unthinkable. She slowly reached out her right hand toward the black plastic pen resting on the table. Her arm was trembling so severely she had to press her wrist against the smooth wood just to steady herself. Her perfectly manicured fingers curled around the cold plastic. The simple act of lifting the pen seemed to require every ounce of physical strength she had left. She pulled the document closer to her. A single silent tear escaped her eye and rolled down her pale cheek, dropping onto the crisp white paper. It was not a tear of remorse or regret for the pain she had caused her family. It was a tear of pure, selfish agony over the loss of her wealth and her power. She pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line. Her hand shook violently, causing the black ink to drag across the page in a jagged, uneven line. It took her several agonizing seconds to complete the signature. With every shaky stroke of the pen, she was officially signing away the empire she had tried so desperately to steal. She finished the signature and let the pen drop from her trembling fingers. It hit the table with a soft, dull tap. She pushed the folder back across the mahogany surface toward me. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I felt absolutely no need to rub salt in her wounds or celebrate her destruction. The victory was completely silent and deeply profound. I simply reached out my calloused hand and pulled the manila folder toward me. I calmly reviewed the jagged, shaky signature, ensuring the legal requirement was completely fulfilled. Once I was satisfied, I carefully closed the folder and slipped it into my scuffed imitation leather briefcase. I snapped the cheap metal locks shut with a quiet, decisive click. I slowly stood up from my chair, buttoning my suit jacket with a deep, steady breath. The heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for the past 8 months was entirely gone. I felt incredibly light and remarkably strong. Barbara looked up at me, her eyes brimming with fresh, desperate tears. She opened her mouth and her voice came out as a weak, pathetic whisper. She tried to offer an apology. She stammered that she was so sorry for everything and claimed she never meant for things to go this far. She begged me to remember the good years we shared and pleaded with me to believe that she still cared for me. The hollow, desperate apology hung in the cold air. It was a completely meaningless gesture from a woman who had just tried to orchestrate my total destruction. I did not offer her a response. I did not give her the satisfaction of my anger or the comfort of my forgiveness. I simply picked up my briefcase and turned my back on her. I walked away from the heavy mahogany table without saying a single word. Winston Carmichael stepped smoothly into step beside me on my right side. Tyler moved quietly from behind my empty chair and fell into step on my left side. Together, the three of us walked toward the heavy frosted glass doors. I did not hesitate and I did not look back over my shoulder. We walked out of the conference room, leaving Barbara sitting entirely alone in the deafening silence of her absolute and permanent defeat. 6 months have passed since the heavy frosted glass doors of the mediation room closed behind me. I stand on the elevated steel catwalk looking down at the sprawling floor of our primary regional distribution hub. The warehouse is a symphony of organized chaos. The loud, rhythmic humming of massive conveyor belts echoes through the cavernous space, mingling with the sharp beeping of forklifts reversing down the concrete aisles. The familiar smell of diesel exhaust and corrugated cardboard fills the air. It is a gritty industrial scent, but to me it is the sweetest fragrance in the entire world. It smells like freedom. It smells like the legacy I built with my own 2 hands, completely secure and thriving. I rest my calloused hands on the cold metal railing of the catwalk, feeling the steady vibration of the machinery humming beneath my boots. The crushing exhaustion that had weighed me down for a year has been entirely replaced by a profound, enduring peace. I am back exactly where I belong, steering the ship I constructed from a single rusted van. I look down at the loading docks and watch my son working on the floor. Tyler is not wearing an expensive tailored suit or a silk tie. He is wearing a bright yellow, high-visibility vest over a simple gray hooded sweatshirt, holding a rugged digital clipboard. He is standing next to a seasoned warehouse manager, carefully checking the inventory manifests for a fleet of departing freight trucks. He is pointing at the cargo bays, asking questions, and actively learning the intricate mechanics of the supply chain. He is not sitting in a corner office waiting for a massive corporate buyout to fund a luxurious lifestyle. He is earning his inheritance the right way, through sweat and dedication and genuine hard work. The healing process between my son and me was not instantaneous. When we walked out of that corporate high-rise building 6 months ago, there was a deep, painful canyon of guilt separating us. Tyler was entirely shattered by the realization that his own mother had manufactured a monstrous deception to purchase his loyalty. He spent weeks apologizing to me, desperately trying to make amends for doubting my character and turning his back on our family business. I did not rush him or demand immediate perfection. I simply welcomed him back into the company and put him to work on the warehouse floor. I wanted him to understand the true value of the empire we were protecting. By standing shoulder to shoulder on the loading docks, reviewing shipping routes, and managing inventory, we slowly rebuilt our fractured relationship. The bond we share now is infinitely stronger than it ever was before, because it is built on a foundation of absolute truth and radical transparency. I watch Tyler successfully dispatch a fleet of delivery trucks, and I feel a deep swelling sense of paternal pride. He looks up toward the catwalk, shielding his eyes from the bright industrial lights, and offers me a genuine, exhausted smile. I nod back at him, acknowledging his hard work. He has finally realized that the empty corporate promises and golden parachutes his mother offered him were nothing but toxic illusions. He understands now that true wealth is not handed to you in a fraudulent settlement document. It is carefully built over decades of honest labor and unwavering integrity. The thought of the fraudulent settlement document naturally brings my mind to Barbara. The swift and absolute destruction of her ambitious empire was staggering to witness. When Winston Carmichael walked out of that conference room, he kept his promise perfectly. The federal wire fraud investigation was relentless and absolutely devastating. Gavin Pierce was immediately stripped of his legal license and permanently disbarred. He was buried under a mountain of federal indictments and subsequent malpractice lawsuits from his former partners, who desperately wanted to distance themselves from his crimes. To pay for her own crushing legal defense and to avoid serving a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary, Barbara was forced to liquidate absolutely everything she owned. She lost the massive suburban house with the manicured lawns and the heated swimming pool. She lost the luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobe, and the pristine country club memberships. I recently heard through a mutual acquaintance that she is currently living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She is working a mundane administrative job just to afford her basic groceries and her monthly rent. The luxurious lifestyle she felt entirely entitled to enjoy has completely evaporated. She gambled our 30-year marriage and our son's future on a secret $50 million payout, and she was left with absolutely nothing. Karma did not arrive screaming in a courtroom. It arrived quietly and methodically, stripping away her wealth and her power until she was forced to face the exact poverty she had tried so desperately to inflict upon me. I turn away from the catwalk and walk slowly toward my modest ground-floor office. The space is small and practical, filled with filing cabinets and a simple wooden desk. There are no panoramic views of the city skyline and no polished mahogany tables. I sit down in my worn leather chair and look at the cheap, scuffed briefcase resting by my feet. It is the exact same bag I carried onto the morning commuter train 6 months ago. I stare at the battered imitation leather and allow myself to deeply reflect on the chaotic journey that completely saved my life. I think about the sheer blind luck of sitting across the aisle from a billionaire private equity chairman. I think about the heavy leather briefcase dropping onto the dirty floor of the train car and the corporate acquisition blueprints scattering everywhere. But mostly I think about my own automatic response. I was a broken, exhausted man heading to my own financial execution. I was carrying the weight of a shattered marriage and a stolen legacy on my shoulders. I had every reason in the world to stare out the window and completely ignore the elderly man struggling to gather his papers, but I did not ignore him. I dropped my own meaningless defense notes, and I slid out of my seat to help a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do. That single quiet moment of basic human decency changed the entire trajectory of my existence. I realize now that true power does not come from aggressive manipulation or slick corporate lawyers. It does not come from forging documents or orchestrating elaborate deceptions to steal from the people who love you. True power comes from the quiet, enduring integrity of choosing to do the right thing when you believe no one important is watching you. I reach down and gently touch the handle of my old briefcase. I have retained 100% of my company and my investments. My son is safe from toxic manipulation and is proudly learning how to run the family business. My future is entirely secure. I lean back in my chair, listening to the comforting rumble of the freight trucks departing the loading docks outside my window. The execution was permanently canceled, and the legacy I built with my calloused hands will proudly survive. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that true power does not come from ruthless manipulation, forged documents, or blind greed. It comes from quiet integrity and basic human decency. When John was at his absolute lowest, facing the complete destruction of his life's work, he did not surrender his character. He chose to help an elderly stranger on a train simply because it was the right thing to do. That small act of kindness became his ultimate salvation. It reminds us that while deceit may offer temporary victories, genuine respect and compassion are the only investments that yield permanent, unbreakable wealth. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences of overcoming betrayal in the comments below.